Welcome to the tunnels that swallowed men whole, to the place where light died and something else began to breathe. January 1970. Tay Ninh Province, South Vietnam. Damp clay walls, dripping humidity, a low hum in the dark. Somewhere beneath the jungles of Cu Chi, a young engineer named Pham Quang Huy pressed his palm to the earth and felt it move. Not from bombs, not from footsteps, but from something slithering, massive, slow, and alive. He whispered to the men beside him, "It's not the air collapsing. It's moving against us." And before they could respond, the dirt ceiling above their heads pulsed like the skin of a living thing. Dust fell in spirals, the lamps flickered, then the earth sighed. You're hearing this because fragments of his tape recorder found years later near a sealed chamber 30 meters below ground captured those sounds. Metallic distortion, heavy scraping, something that didn't echo like man or machine, something that seemed to answer back. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this voice. Because tonight, you're part of the record. At the height of the Vietnam War, the Cu Chi tunnels stretched for more than 250 kilometers beneath the ground, a subterranean labyrinth connecting hidden hospitals, supply depots, and command bunkers. It was a war fought in darkness, inches from suffocation, in tunnels so narrow men had to crawl dragging rifles behind them. The world above roared with jets and fire, but down here silence had weight. And sometimes, silence answered. Huy was a structural engineer, 26 years old, assigned by the People's Army to study the long-term integrity of the tunnel system after repeated bombing. He was precise, cautious, a man of numbers and geometry, not superstition. But in his notebook, later found torn, soaked, smeared with red clay, he wrote one line again and again. "The tunnels are breathing." In the weeks before his disappearance, he reported strange vibrations that didn't match seismic patterns. Entire segments of tunnels that warped overnight. Mud collapsing in perfect circles. Equipment dragged off into deeper shafts where no maps existed. He marked those locations with small stars, as if charting constellations beneath the soil. Soldiers stationed near Ben Din Base began whispering about giant worms, enormous unseen creatures that tunneled beside them. They spoke of rhythmic tremors like slow, deliberate heartbeats under the ground. One medic swore he heard the sound of soil grinding, not collapsing, but moving horizontally, as if something alive was reshaping the earth itself. Most dismissed it as stress, the auditory illusions of men deprived of sunlight. But one thing couldn't be ignored every time the vibrations intensified. Communication cables were severed, then reappeared weeks later, perfectly intact, rerouted through entirely new tunnels. Tunnels no one had built. Huy's last recorded report was transmitted at 02:17 a.m. on March 3, 1970. His voice, steady but hoarse, described a sealed anomaly beneath Sector 12, an unregistered cavity 30 meters below the old hospital shaft. He mentioned warm air, a faint rhythmic echo, and the unmistakable smell of sulfur and iron. Then came the static, a long dragging sound, like a shovel scraping rock, followed by a low vibration that distorted the signal completely. When a rescue team descended 2 days later, the tunnel was caved in, compacted so tightly that even dynamite failed to open it. But deeper down, behind a wall of fused clay, they found what looked like grooves, parallel lines, curved, enormous. Those grooves would later be catalogued by Soviet geologists in 1972, mislabeled as ancient root systems. But the composition of the soil told another story. The clay had been heated from within. What could generate that kind of heat deep under the jungle, far from any bomb crater? Decades later, after the war ended, an Australian archaeological team revisited Cu Chi to document the remaining tunnel systems. Among them was Dr. Eleanor Haynes, an anthropologist obsessed with wartime folklore. Her notes describe local veterans pointing to certain sealed shafts and warning Kong Dao Choda, Dat Sungada. Don't dig there. The earth lives there. Haynes's team recorded seismic irregularities beneath those same shafts, faint but rhythmic, identical in frequency to biological respiration. Yet, official reports dismissed it as groundwater movement. Her field notes end abruptly on page 47 with a scribble. The engineer was right. Now imagine standing there, jungle heat pressing down, the faint drone of cicadas above, and beneath your boots the subtle quiver of living ground. Would you dare to go down? Would you crawl into a tunnel where the air itself feels watched? Hui did, and what he found or thought he found would blur the line between war and myth. Every photograph from his mission is missing. Every document bears the same blacked-out section, anomalous cavity cause undetermined. His family was told he died in a collapse. No remains were ever found. But years later, during maintenance in a nearby tunnel sector, workers discovered something embedded in the clay, a metallic ring fused into stone, perfectly circular diameter 2 meters. The ring pulsed faintly under magnetic detection, as if it had once carried current. And right beside it, a fragment of tape reel. Hui's voice again, barely audible through static. It's not a tunnel anymore. It's a throat. The tape ends there. Tonight you'll hear that story as it was found. You'll hear the facts, the folklore, and the echoes that refuse to die beneath Cu Chi's soil. Because what if in the heart of that war, men weren't the only things fighting underground? If you can still hear the hum by the end of this episode, maybe it's not just in your head. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what you think is moving beneath us. Because this time the war isn't over. It's only waiting. February 1970. Dusk falls over the Iron Triangle, the jungle breathing in slow rhythm with the heat of war. The air tastes like cordite and sap. Helicopters hum somewhere far above, muffled by the canopy, their blades pushing down waves of dust that never quite reach the tunnels below. Down there, it's another world, a war turned inside out. The Americans called Cu Chi the Black Echo. The Vietnamese called it Địa Đao, the earth that hides the living. It began as simple foxholes carved with rusted shovels during the French occupation in the 1940s. But by the 1960s, it had become a living organism, a 3-level labyrinth winding through red clay and sandstone reaching from Saigon's outskirts to the Cambodian border. Underground kitchens burned smokeless fires. Hospitals hummed with morphine whispers and command posts glowed with kerosene light. Above ground, B-52s thundered. Below, whispers and breathing replaced gunfire. Imagine crawling on your belly through a shaft no wider than your shoulders, your lamp flickering the air thick with the stench of bats and earth. You count seconds, not meters. The sound of your own heartbeat becomes a compass. And somewhere behind you, a sound. Not footsteps, not water. Just a slow grinding, like rock against rock. That was the rhythm of the Cu Chi tunnels, the heartbeat of survival, sometimes mistaken for something else entirely. By 1970, the war had changed shape. The Americans launched Operation Cedar Falls, flooding the area with bulldozers, napalm, and explosives. Villages were evacuated, forests stripped bare. Yet every time they thought they had crushed the tunnel network, new shafts appeared overnight. They called it ghost engineering tunnels dug faster than logic allowed. Reports came in from patrols who swore they heard movement after bombing raids, the earth shifting, resealing itself as if alive. That was when the People's Army assigned a young structural engineer, Pham Quang Huy, to investigate. His orders were simple: determine which sectors were still safe, repair those that had collapsed, and document any non-structural anomalies. He arrived at Ben Din in mid-January with a team of 4 miners, 1 medic, and a radio operator. Huy carried nothing unusual: survey maps, a compass, a notebook wrapped in oilcloth, and a Soviet TK-66 tape recorder. The jungle was loud when they arrived. Cicadas screamed, mortars echoed from afar. But the moment they descended, the world went still, the kind of silence that presses on the eardrums. Hui's first report noted temperature fluctuations inconsistent with surface readings. The deeper they went, the warmer it became. At 30 meters down, his thermometer read 38 degrees Celsius, even though the outside temperature was barely 25. He suspected chemical reaction in the soil, but the medic joked, "Maybe the Earth's cooking something." They laughed. But later that night, the thermometer cracked from heat. For days, they mapped forgotten passages, shafts marked with faint chalk symbols, arrows pointing into blackness. Some tunnels curved back into themselves like veins. Others ended in dead chambers, circular cavities where the air trembled. Hui began calling them lungs. The term appeared again in his notebook, underlined twice. Above ground, American patrols had no idea how close they were to these chambers. Every night, their seismographs picked up faint tremors assumed to be collapsing tunnels. But U.S. intelligence analysts noticed a pattern: the tremors pulsed at consistent intervals roughly every 90 seconds with minor fluctuations. Mechanical anomaly, the report said. Possibly machinery underground. There was no machinery, only men. And something else that didn't fit the rhythm of war. Local villagers spoke quietly about Gyundat Khonglo, the giant worms. Not creatures of flesh, they said, but spirits of the fallen, condemned to crawl beneath the earth forever. When the soil quivered and the tunnels bent, they said the worms were moving, shifting the war itself. He, being a rational man, dismissed it, but he couldn't ignore the physical evidence. Sections of clay were fused, melted, as if touched by heat from within. His instruments jammed near those areas. Compasses spun aimlessly. He wrote magnetic interference source unknown. Feels like heartbeat through the wall. At night, he played back his tape recordings, measuring echo delay to estimate tunnel dimensions. But on one reel, he caught something else beneath the static and drip of water, a low frequency like distant breathing. The waveform was biological. Not machinery, not artillery. A sound that seemed to inhale when they exhaled. In late February, Hui requested authorization to excavate a sealed chamber marked on an old 1966 map labeled Sector 12B. His superior denied the request. The area was unstable, but Hui went anyway. He told his team they were simply verifying collapse zones. They descended at night, lights dimmed to conserve batteries. The medic noted later in his own diary, found years after, that the air felt charged, like before lightning. Their lamps flickered blue. The soil around them shimmered with faint phosphorescence, perhaps bioluminescent fungi, though none of that type was native to Kuchi. At 02:00 hours, they reached a blockage, compacted clay glowing faintly, as if backlit. Hui tapped it with his shovel. The sound wasn't dull earth. It was hollow, resonant. He leaned close, pressed his ear against the wall, and froze. He heard movement. Not scurrying rats or dripping water, but a sliding, pulsing motion, slow, deliberate, immense. He turned to his men and whispered, "We're not alone down here." They began to retreat, but the radio cut out. Then came the tremor, soft at first, then building. The ground rippled. Clay dust poured from the ceiling. One miner screamed that he saw something bulging through the wall like a bubble of flesh beneath skin. They ran. The lights died. Only 2 surfaced hours later, dazed faces coated in gray dust. They said Hui had gone back to retrieve the recorder. No one saw him again. Above ground, commanders ordered the tunnel sealed. Official reason, structural collapse. Unofficially, rumors spread fast that Hui's team had dug into something ancient, something that had been there long before the war. Weeks later, American patrols detected renewed seismic activity in the same area, but this time the readings moved laterally faster than tunneling could explain. Living fault line, one geologist joked. But the readings continued until the area was bombed flat in April. After the war, when the craters cooled and the land was retilled, farmers complained their fields sank overnight, always in perfect circles. Hui's mother received his belongings in a rusted tin box, a broken compass, a strip of magnetic tape, and a piece of fused clay shaped like a spiral. The clay still carried faint warmth when handled. That was the context a war fought on 2 fronts, one between nations and one between man and the earth itself. Down there, geometry failed, time warped, and sound traveled in ways no science could explain. And somewhere, buried beneath layers of official silence, the recordings still hum. Because once you've heard the ground breathe, you can never forget its rhythm. He wasn't a soldier by nature. Pham Quang Hui had been a builder, an architect of quiet ambitions. Before the war, he designed irrigation systems along the Mekong, precise, clean, mathematical. He liked symmetry, blueprints, the certainty of measurement. But in wartime Vietnam, the clean lines of paper gave way to the jagged geometry of survival. The army had taken his steady hands and turned them toward the dark, toward a world beneath the ground that defied logic and symmetry alike. Hui had grown up near Thu Dao Mot, in a village half swallowed by the river. His father had been a carpenter, his mother a schoolteacher. He was soft-spoken, the kind of man who measured every word before letting it out. In photographs, the few that survived, he looked slightly away from the camera, as if already hearing something others couldn't. He was fascinated by sound. As a boy, he had built small reed flutes and buried them in the mud after storms to see if the wind could still make them sing. He said once everything buried has its own music. When the war came, he didn't volunteer for the front. He was drafted into the engineering corps, his mathematical precision valued for mapping tunnel systems that others only feared. He didn't believe in ghosts or gods, only in pressure, density, and stress. Yet every report he sent back began to drift from the technical to the poetic. One line written in a cramped hand on brown paper: "The soil here remembers. It resists differently where men have died." His commanding officer scolded him, "Stick to structure, not superstition." But Hui couldn't separate them anymore. The deeper he went, the more alive the earth seemed to him. There's a surviving testimony from Lê Văn Minh, the radio operator who escaped Sector 12B. Recorded in 1981 for a veteran's archive, he described Hui as quiet like a priest. Minh said he would touch the walls before every dig, close his eyes, and listen. He said the earth talked in frequencies too low for machines. I laughed. But then I started to feel it too. Minh's voice trembled in that old tape, his accent thick, his tone uncertain. He said one night, "Minh, if it moves, don't fight it. Just record the sound." By February 25th, Hui's behavior had changed. He stopped sleeping. He drew spirals in the dirt, tracing patterns that mirrored seismic graphs. His notes were no longer measurements, but symbols, concentric circles, lines that looked like waveforms. The medic in his team, Tran Duc, later wrote that Hui claimed to see pulses in the air. The others joked he was losing it, but Hui insisted there was order beneath the chaos. "Something is mapping us," he said. "Something older than us, using our tunnels as veins." He started using his tape recorder differently, not for dictation, but for listening. He would leave it running in sealed shafts overnight, then play back the reels the next morning. Most of it was static, dripping water, scurrying rats. But beneath it all, a pattern emerged, a low thrum, spaced evenly like breathing. When slowed down, it revealed modulations, rhythmic fluctuations, too precise for randomness. He began calling it the pulse. His last surviving notes label it simply biological, deep. In one entry, he compared the tunnel system to the digestive tract of a living creature. The main chambers as stomachs, the connecting shafts as arteries. If you map the airflow, he wrote, it circulates. It exhales. His language became almost feverish. The clay vibrates when you speak. The soil replies. There was one moment recorded by Minh before the collapse that still chills researchers who've studied it. In the recording, you can hear Hui muttering coordinates while tapping a metal rod against the wall. Then he pauses, as if listening. There's a long silence, and faintly, almost below human hearing, a sound like a distant groan. Not mechanical, not human. It rises, fades, then returns, closer. Minh whispers, "What is that?" Hui replies softly. "It's moving through us." Then the tape cuts to static. After the war, specialists analyzed those reels. The sound frequencies matched neither seismic nor environmental interference. They existed below 18 Hz infrasound. At that level, the human body doesn't hear, it feels. Eyes blur, fear rises without reason, nausea sets in. It's the frequency of terror itself. Whether the source was geological or something stranger, no one could prove. But Hui perhaps had felt it first. People who worked with him said he had a strange calmness, even when the world around him crumbled. During one bombing raid, while everyone else pressed their faces to the mud, he stared at the trembling walls, whispering calculations. He wasn't afraid of the earth, Minh said. He was afraid of silence. In early March, he met with a senior officer who warned him to stop talking about worms or living tunnels. They feared rumors spreading through the ranks. Soldiers already refused to enter certain shafts, saying the walls were warm like skin. The officer's report, declassified in 1989, describes Hui's final state, exhausted, possibly hallucinating. Claims tunnels exhibit rhythmic motion, consistent with respiration. Requests additional recording equipment, recommended rest and reassignment. He never received either. That night, he returned underground. Minh said he looked different, pupils dilated, voice quiet. He kept saying, "It's close now. It's trying to remember me." Who was he really, this man, between science and madness? Some see him as a visionary, a pioneer of underground architecture whose mind simply cracked under pressure. Others call him the first casualty of something that was never war to begin, with a collision between human ambition and whatever ancient rhythm sleeps beneath the soil. When his mother was interviewed years later, she refused to believe he died. "No body, no death," she said. "He just went where he always wanted, under the ground." She described strange dreams, hearing her son's voice calling from beneath the floorboards, whispering that the tunnels were safe now that the earth had forgiven him. Folklore grew from that silence. In Cu Chi today, guides still tell tourists of the engineer who listened to the earth. Some say his spirit guards the tunnels, that if you press your ear to the wall in total darkness, you can still hear his recorder spinning. Others say his body was absorbed, turned into clay, part of the labyrinth itself. A few veterans swear they saw a figure moving in the deeper chambers years after barefoot, covered in dust, humming through the dark. But those who studied his recordings found something even stranger. The last reel, the one found fused in clay, contains faint human breathing, overlaying the static. 2 rhythms. One fast human, one slow, impossibly deep. When isolated, that deeper pulse continues long after the human voice stops. If you close your eyes and listen, it sounds like the earth itself exhaling. And somewhere in that long breath, you might imagine a voice, calm, precise, mathematical, whispering from the clay. "Don't be afraid. It's only the sound of everything buried learning to move again." That was Pham Quang Huy, the tunnel engineer of Cu Chi, the man who measured ghosts by their frequency and tried to turn the language of the earth into equations. He vanished, yes, but what he left behind still vibrates. Because once a man learns to hear the soil breathe, he never stops listening. March 3rd, 1970. The air in Cu Chi felt heavier that night, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. The war above had dimmed for a moment. No bombs, no choppers, just the low, endless hum of insects. In the tunnels below, Pham Quang Huy and his small team prepared to descend into Sector 12B for the last time. The mission log, preserved in fragments, begins with his voice calm, precise, almost too calm. Test recording. Depth 30 meters. Temperature unstable. Structure vibrating. Commence excavation. Min Thi, radio operator, later said that when Huy spoke those words, the walls around them shuddered slightly, like muscle flexing. They carried only 2 lamps, 1 pickaxe, and the small tape recorder strapped to Huy's chest. The others waited above ground, manning the winch. They told him to keep the radio open. He said he would. He lied. Minutes after descent, radio contact began to crackle. Static pulsed in short bursts, 1, 2, 3, then a drawn-out distortion, like breath being exhaled directly into the microphone. Min tried calling down. No answer. The earth seemed to absorb the sound. Down below, the team moved through narrow corridors where the clay shimmered faintly with a wet sheen. Their footsteps echoed irregularly, as if the tunnel shifted behind them, swallowing sound. Huy marked the walls with chalk, small white arrows pointing back. But each time they turned to check, some of the arrows were gone. The clay was smooth again. They reached the sealed chamber at 02:11 a.m. The blockage looked unnatural, compacted in layers that rippled outward like a muscle frozen mid-contraction. Huy knelt, pressed his ear to it, and whispered, "It's hollow." He tapped 3 times with his shovel. A pause. Then 3 faint thuds came back. Perfect rhythm. Trandukthi medic wanted to leave. He said it was pressure echo acoustic illusion. But Huy only smiled. "Pressure doesn't mimic you," he said. "It listens." He began digging slow, deliberate strokes. The air thickened. Clay dust spiraled in the lamplight. Minutes passed, then something changed. The tunnel temperature spiked. The flame of the lamp bent inward, as if air was being drawn into the wall itself. Min's last transmission captures Huy's voice in fragments. Surface temperature rising. There's light, followed by a deep vibration that made the reel distort. They said the sound felt like a pulse, a massive heartbeat shaking dust from the ceiling. Huy shouted something indistinct, and the line went dead. At 03:00 a.m., the men at the winch felt the rope jerk once, then go slack. They waited. No signal, no call, only the low rumble of earth shifting beneath their boots. At dawn, they descended halfway before turning back. Heat radiated from the clay so strong that their gloves began to smoke. When they returned hours later, the tunnel had sealed itself. Not collapsed, sealed. The clay had fused into solid stone. What happened in those final minutes became the spine of every theory that followed: science, superstition, and madness, all fighting to claim the same silence. The official military report, written 4 days later, lists catastrophic geological event as cause of disappearance. But beneath the typed lines in pen, someone added, vibrations continued for 11 minutes, post-collapse. Origin unknown. In later decades, geological teams studied those fused sections of soil. Microscopic analysis revealed vitrification. Clay turned to glass by heat, exceeding 1,200 degrees. There was no bomb crater above, no chemical burn, no sign of fire. Yet something had melted the earth from within. And then there were the grooves. Smooth, curved impressions running parallel through the solid clay nearly 2 meters apart. They spiraled like the ribbing of an enormous worm, yet the surface bore no biological residue. No bones, no carbon, only heat-fused pattern. When the team photographed them, the negatives warped faint streaks of light running across the film like veins. The locals didn't need photographs. They already had names for it. Kongyun sat the iron worm. They said it slept under the fields, moving when men dug too deep, reshaping tunnels that trespassed on its paths. They claimed it fed not on flesh, but on memory, consuming the names of those who vanished underground, so they could never be mourned. One woman from Fumi village told researchers she'd dreamed of the earth trembling beneath her house, and in the dream, a voice whispered, "The engineer is home." The next morning, her well was filled with red clay compacted in spirals. The Americans had their own explanation. Intelligence notes recovered from declassified archives mentioned subterranean pressure conduits, possibly caused by volcanic gas pockets. But the Kuchi region has no volcanic history. The pressure maps make no sense, lines running in perfect circles like fingerprints pressed into stone. There was one more anomaly. In April 1970, after repeated bombings of the area, aerial reconnaissance captured heat signatures emerging from sealed ground. The shapes pulsed, circular, rhythmic, migrating westward beneath the forest. The recordings were filed under thermal distortions. Analysts noted they moved at 2 meters per second, too fast for magma, too slow for machinery. Somewhere amid those readings, one circle paused exactly at the coordinates of Hui's last known chamber. Then it disappeared. Months later, when the monsoon came, rainwater exposed a small section of that fused clay. Embedded in it was a fragment of steel, a buckle from a standard-issue engineer's belt. It was bent but clean, as if it had been polished by movement, not decay. Folklore soon replaced facts. Children were told never to dig alone, never to whistle underground. The worm hears music, they said, and it remembers the sound of men. Veterans refused to camp near old tunnel mouths, claiming they still felt tremors beneath their tents, soft, pulsing, steady. But there was one more detail, something the official files omit. A second tape labeled March 3, 1970, Sector 12B, was discovered in the 1980s during a tunnel restoration project. The reel was almost entirely corroded, but engineers restored 30 seconds. The sound begins with static, then faint breathing, then a low, wet, dragging noise. Hui's voice whispers slow, as if speaking from far away. It's not soil anymore. A pause. It's opening. Then nothing, just a long vibration, the kind that seems to travel through the body rather than air. No one could explain how the tape survived when everything else had fused into stone. Some say it wasn't buried at all, that it surfaced on its own, carried upward by the shifting ground. The incident vanished into bureaucracy. Families received medals, not answers. Reports were sealed, redacted, then quietly forgotten. But the vibration never stopped. Farmers decades later reported hearing low hums at night, the soil trembling beneath their fields. Geologists dismissed it as residual war damage, collapsing tunnels. Yet the tremors followed no pattern of erosion. They pulsed. They waited. And in 1995, a new tunnel collapse near Ben Kat revealed a fresh cavity, smooth, circular, lined with fused clay. Inside, there was nothing except an old compass pointing downward. No one touched it. Because in Kuchi, some tunnels were built by men, and some, they say, by something that used men's hands to dig itself awake. Whatever Hui had uncovered that night, whether it was geology, ghost, or something older than both, It changed the way the earth itself remembered him. And maybe in the slow heartbeat of the ground, he's still there, breathing through the clay, listening for anyone brave enough to knock 3 times. 1, 2, 3. Then wait for the earth to answer back. The years rolled on, and the jungle began to heal, or at least to pretend. By 1975, the war had ended, the airfields fell silent, and the tunnels of Cu Chi became relics, bones of a vanished beast, buried beneath layers of memory and soil. The government sealed most entrances, filling shafts with concrete, turning others into museum exhibits. Tourists crawled through widened passages, snapping photographs, unaware that many corridors had never been mapped, that some paths beneath their feet ran deeper, darker, unaccounted for on any blueprint. But beneath those layers of peace, something still stirred. In the dry season of 1980, a military engineering unit was dispatched to reopen part of the old tunnel system near Ben Duoc. The team's goal was to survey potential soil instability after a series of sinkholes appeared near old bomb craters. Leading the project was Captain Nguyen Din Hao, a veteran of the Southern campaigns, pragmatic and skeptical of ghost stories. He brought with him a small team, 6 men, all experienced tunnel workers, and a Soviet-made geophone to detect underground vibrations. On their second night, as they drilled sampling holes, the instrument began to hum. The readings showed something impossible: consistent circular vibrations, about 15 meters below the surface, each pulse precisely 75 seconds apart. Hao assumed it was residual echo from underground water. But when the pulses continued after the pumps stopped, when the hum began to synchronize with their footsteps, then the men stopped laughing. They opened an old shaft, one that matched the coordinates of Sector 12B long, buried after the 1970 collapse. The air that rose from it smelled metallic, almost sweet. The geophone needle went wild, spiking into a continuous hum. Hao ordered a descent. Inside, the tunnel walls glistened with condensed moisture, reflecting their headlamps in strange, rippling patterns. One worker shouted he thought he saw something moving beneath the surface of the clay, as if the walls were transparent for a heartbeat, showing veins beneath. Another swore he heard knocking, soft, deliberate. They pressed their lights to the wall and saw 3 faint indentations arranged vertically, too uniform to be random, too human to ignore. When they reached the lowest point, they found the passage divided by a smooth arch, not carved but melted. The clay hardened like glass. The shape was unnatural, geometrically perfect. Hao touched it. It was warm. He pulled his hand back and saw moisture condense where his skin had touched, as if the surface had exhaled. Then the hum began again, low and steady. One of the men, a former miner named Tan, placed his ear to the arch. His eyes went wide. "Ko Ida Oben Kia," he said. "Someone's on the other side." Hao laughed nervously, the rational laugh of a man who knows he's losing logic. "Sound travels strangely underground," he said. But when he leaned in, he too heard it, a faint tapping, slow and rhythmic. 1, 2, 3. They called for the others to bring tools. The first hammer strike rang like metal against metal. The sound echoed deep into the darkness, followed by an answer. Not an echo, an answer. The geophone above ground registered a surge, a deep vibration spreading outward in a circular wave. The earth trembled. Above them, birds took flight from the trees in great dark swarms. The hum rose in pitch, trembling through the men's bodies like pressure before thunder. Dust rained from the ceiling. Then silence. The men scrambled up the shaft. The last out was Tan. When he reached the surface, he screamed. His boots were glowing faintly red, the soles melted into the soil. He threw them off and collapsed. The ground beneath the shaft had turned black, charred like it had absorbed heat from within. The air shimmered. For weeks afterward, the team reported tremors at the same hour every night. Always 3 pulses, then stillness. They abandoned the site. No report was ever filed publicly. But a year later, a local farmer unearthed a metal object near the same location, a fractured reel-to-reel tape corroded and fused to a gear housing stamped with the serial number TK66. When cleaned, the tape revealed nothing recognizable, just bursts of low-frequency sound, punctuated by static. But slowed-down spectrograms showed patterns repeating waveforms that matched human speech cadences, though at frequencies below hearing. A linguist from Hanoi analyzed the data and found harmonic signatures identical to those in Huai's original recordings from 1970. The chance of coincidence was less than 1 in a million. So what were the odds that two recordings made 15 years apart by different equipment could produce the same subterranean rhythm unless the source was still there? By the late 1980s, Cu Chi had become a monument to endurance. School children marched through reconstructed tunnels, their guides rehearsed stories of heroism, not horror. But somewhere below the tourist paths sealed with concrete lay the forbidden sectors, the ones veterans called the sleeping veins. They were not to be entered, not to be discussed. Still, rumors spread. A former technician, now retired, claimed that during maintenance of electrical lines, he found a section of clay that hummed when touched. Like a live wire, he said. But there was no electricity. Another told of hearing whispers through the soil, words too muffled to understand, but distinctly human. It was like someone reciting coordinates. In 1994, during a drought, the Saigon River dropped to its lowest level in decades, revealing part of an old tunnel mouth along the bank. Inside was a chamber lined with what appeared to be metal rings fused into clay. The rings emitted a weak magnetic field pulsing irregularly. Geologists called them artifacts of wartime equipment, perhaps melted shrapnel. But when samples were tested, the alloy composition didn't match any known wartime material. It contained traces of iridium, an element found in meteorites. The discovery reignited the legend. Newspapers ran short, nervous stories before authorities ordered them withdrawn. Yet whispers persisted that perhaps the Cu Chi network had tapped into something prehistoric, a geological vein of unknown origin, and that Hui, the engineer who listened too deeply, had awakened it. Some said he hadn't died at all, that he'd become part of it. His consciousness dissolved into the living labyrinth. "He is the pulse," one old soldier muttered in a documentary interview before cutting the camera short. In 2002, a foreign documentary crew came to Cu Chi planning to film inside the preserved tunnels. Their lead sound technician, an American named Carl Jensen, brought advanced audio equipment to capture ambient underground frequencies. On their third night, as they tested microphones near the sealed chambers, the recorders began to pick up deep oscillations, rhythmic, constant, impossibly regular. At first, Jensen thought it was machinery interference. Then he realized it synced with his own heartbeat. When he stopped breathing, the vibration stopped too. He described the moment later in his field notes. "It felt sentient, like something beneath the soil was listening through me." The next day, he refused to enter the tunnels again. 2 weeks after returning home, he mailed the audio files to a Vietnamese researcher with a single note. "Play it slow. You'll hear him." Those who did said the slowed recording contained faint words buried beneath the infrasound syllables, distorted but recognizable. Sector 12, open. That phrase appeared nowhere in the documentary, nowhere in official transcripts. But those who knew Hui's handwriting remembered those were the last words in his notebook. It was as if the tunnels themselves were finishing his sentence decades later. When the Vietnamese government reinforced the area in 2005, pouring concrete over the last unsealed shafts, workers reported feeling vibrations beneath the fresh cement. 3 pulses, steady, deliberate. One worker, young and skeptical, laughed and knocked 3 times back with his hammer. The next morning, when he returned, the section of cement he'd poured had cracked clean through, not random but circular, like the mouth of something waiting to breathe. No one worked there again. Sometimes when tourists stand in the Cu Chi exhibits and the guide pauses mid-story, a faint tremor ripples through the earth. The lights flicker, the air shifts. Most never notice, but the veterans do. They step back, eyes fixed on the ground, and whisper the same phrase, half prayer, half warning. "Đừng gọi nó dậy." Don't wake it. Because somewhere beneath the jungles of Vietnam, deeper than any map, deeper than memory, something still moves, tracing the paths men carved in war, repeating their rhythm, keeping their secrets. And if you ever find yourself there, standing above that ancient clay, listen closely. The hum might find you first. 3 pulses, a long breath, then stillness. The engineer's heartbeat, or the Earth's maybe now. They are one and the same. By the time the archives reopened in 2010, the Cu Chi legend had hardened into myth, a story whispered in half-truths and newspaper footnotes. Historians treated it as folklore born from trauma, the kind of tale that war leaves behind when it cannot bear its own silence. But inside a storage room at the old Ministry of Defense, one file remained sealed longer than the rest. Case 12B Structural Anomaly, March 1970. When the seal was finally cut for digitization, the clerk who handled it said the paper inside smelled faintly of burnt metal and wet clay. The first document was a field report typed in Russian marked Confidential, PAVN Engineering Exchange. It detailed an analysis conducted by a Soviet geological consultant named Dr. Arkady Volkov, who had visited Kuchi in 1972. His report described soil samples containing vitrified quartz granules consistent with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Celsius, impossible through mechanical friction or combustion. The conclusion was crossed out but legible beneath the ink thermal pattern consistent with contained plasma movement. Volkov had annotated the margins with hand-drawn spirals noting frequency intervals beside them 75 seconds, 73, 74. He compared them to rhythmic ground oscillations recorded near Siberian permafrost fissures, where locals also spoke of the breathing earth. His final line read, "Do not reopen tunnels. They are not stable in a geological sense nor in a temporal one." That phrase, temporal instability, appeared again in a U.S. report, declassified years later. Operation Deep Scan. An American post-war reconnaissance effort sent seismic probes into the old tunnel regions between 1973 and 1975. Their findings mirrored Volkov's rhythmic pulses, nearly identical in amplitude, spreading in circular patterns that defied known geologic activity. One analyst scribbled, "Seems responsive pauses when sensors move." The file ended with a red stamp, "Unverified phenomena." Parallel stories began to emerge from both sides, two narratives running like twin tunnels under history. On one hand, the scientific heat pressure vibration, perhaps magnetotelluric resonance in high iron soil. On the other, the living folklore spreading among veterans and villagers who refused to step near certain ground. Both stories contradicted and mirrored each other at once, two reflections of the same dark mirror. In the villages near Ben Duoc, elders told of a whisper line, places where the soil seemed to hum with human voices during heavy rain. They said these were the lost tunnels calling to each other, still carrying orders from a war that never ended. Farmers would mark such spots with bamboo stakes wrapped in red cloth, not as warning, but respect. "We don't stop it," one old man told a reporter. "We listen. It's how we know the ground is still alive." Meanwhile, modern engineers scoffed until 2013, when a Vietnamese telecom company attempted to lay fiber optic cables near the same region. Workers reported their drilling equipment overheating, inexplicably sensors malfunctioning, and GPS drift so severe their location data looped in circles. One satellite reading showed the drill site displaced 6 meters north, then 6 meters south within minutes. The final image captured a distortion, a blurred ring where the ground seemed to warp. A technician who reviewed the footage claimed he heard something in the recording's background, a faint ticking like an old tape reel turning. When slowed down, the sound matched the pulse pattern from Hui's 1970 recordings. 2 layers, 2 explanations. The scientists spoke of magnetic anomalies and ferroresonance. The locals whispered of the engineer's worm still tunneling, still charting new veins. Somewhere between the equations and the prayers, truth began to flicker, unstable, shifting like heat above asphalt. It was around this time that a young researcher named Dr. Lê Thanh arrived from Hanoi University, determined to separate myth from measurable fact. She specialized in archaeoacoustics, the study of how ancient structures shape sound. For her, the Kuchi network was a perfect laboratory, kilometers of enclosed space built from clay known to resonate at specific frequencies. Her hypothesis was simple, that the so-called earth breathing was the product of harmonic resonance triggered by seasonal temperature changes. She installed microphonic sensors along sealed sections and waited. For 2 weeks, nothing. Then, on the 17th night, the sensors detected movement, faint pressure waves traveling through the soil. They followed no pattern of wind rain or animal motion. Then listened through headphones, expecting random noise. Instead, she heard rhythm. 3 slow pulses, pause, 3 again. She adjusted the gain filtering frequencies below 20 Hz, and through the vibration, she swore she heard breathing. Not human, not mechanical. The rise and fall of pressure, the long exhale of something vast. She increased amplification, and beneath the breath came a voice. Faint, fractured, but unmistakably human. It spoke Vietnamese, clipped, formal, almost ceremonial engineer report, Sector 12, the air moves again. Then froze. The phrase matched the final words on Hui's transcript from 1970. Her colleagues dismissed it as pareidolia, the brain's habit of finding pattern in chaos. But when she replayed the recording at half speed, the same voice returned, this time ending with 3 knocks. After that night, her instruments failed one by one. The memory drives burned out, and the data logs filled with nothing but spirals, ASCII characters, repeating endlessly. When she printed the last surviving file, the paper jammed halfway, leaving a circular scorch mark on the page. Then left Cu Chi the next day, refusing interviews. In her final email to the university, she wrote only one sentence: "There's no folklore left, only continuation." The press never saw her notes, but word leaked through colleagues. Within months, a new wave of legend rose that the tunnels themselves were a living archive, replaying the memories of those entombed within them. Veterans began reporting dreams of the earth pulsing beneath their beds. One even claimed he woke to find red clay dust on his hands. And so the line between fact and folklore collapsed like the walls between 2 tunnels meeting underground. Historians tried to reconstruct Hui's last hours from fragments, tape reels, reports, witness testimony, but nothing aligned perfectly. One said the ground burned, another that it melted. A third insisted they saw light beneath the clay like a lantern shining through blood. Each account contradicted the others, yet all agreed on the rhythm: 3 pulses. Always 3. A folklorist named Pham Duan compiled them into what she called The Thrice Beating Earth, a collection blending field reports with oral accounts, arranging each version like musical stanzas. Her conclusion blurred fact into liturgy. It breathes because we carved lungs into it. It remembers because we taught it our names. At the National Archives, one surviving artifact from Sector 12B is displayed under glass, the fractured tape reel fused into a spiral of metal and clay. It hums faintly when the room is quiet. Guards say it's static from the display's wiring. But once during a blackout, the hum grew louder, steady, rhythmic. The security camera froze its frame, twisting into concentric rings. When power returned, the hum was gone. The reel had shifted a few centimeters clockwise. Today, the Cu Chi tunnels draw thousands of visitors every year. Guides repeat rehearsed lines about courage and sacrifice. They never mention the sealed chambers, the forbidden sectors, or the engineer who vanished into the clay. Yet sometimes when the crowds thin and the lights dim, a guide will lower his voice and tell you what he heard, while alone one night, a faint knocking deep in the walls. He says it always comes in 3s. Scientists will continue to argue. Believers will continue to listen. Between them runs a tunnel. Neither side can fully map a space where the pulse of the earth merges with the memory of men. And somewhere inside that darkness, maybe still tracing spirals through the endless clay, a voice murmurs equations no one else can hear. 3 pulses, a pause. The engineer is still reporting. The war ended half a century ago, but the ground has never stopped whispering. The jungles of Cu Chi stand green again, their craters softened by rain, their scars hidden under roots. Tourists now walk the shaded paths with bottled water, and cameras smiling for photos at the tunnel mouths where once men crawled through fire. They laugh when the guide switches off the light for a moment of darkness, a harmless taste of fear neatly packaged for history. Then the lamps flicker back on and the story resumes safe again. But beneath that thin layer of peace, something older keeps breathing. When the museum closed one humid evening in 2018, the night guard, his name was Bin, lingered near the glass case where Hui's notebook and the fused tape reel were kept. He'd worked there 15 years, long enough to know every hum of the generators, every creak of the floorboards. But that night, the hum was different. It came not from the display, but from the ground. 3 slow pulses, steady, deliberate. Bin bent down, pressed his palm to the floor, and swore he felt warmth, like the pulse of an animal far beneath. He didn't file a report. He just went home, washed the clay off his hands, and prayed. A week later, the security footage caught something most visitors never saw. Midnight, empty corridors, the camera aimed at the Sector 12B exhibit, flickered its image, bending for 3 seconds. Inside the glass case, the reel turned once, one slow rotation, and stopped. When the museum reopened the next morning, no one mentioned it. But the tape had moved. In the archives, the pattern continues. The microfilm reels hum faintly when scanned. The analog cassettes distort into rhythmic static. A technician once joked that the files were alive. 2 days later, his hard drive crashed, leaving behind only corrupted code rows of repeating numbers 12 to 12, 12. Historians still debate what became of Pham Quang Huy. Some say he died in the collapse, his body vaporized by heat and pressure. Others, like Dr. Le Than, who abandoned the field, after hearing the subterranean voice, believe his consciousness merged with the tunnels themselves. He became the resonance she once wrote. Every time the ground hums, that's him finishing his report. Beyond the laboratories and reports, folklore still moves. In the villages, the legend of Ngoy Kisudat, the engineer of the earth, has taken root. Children leave bowls of rice and salt near the old vents, asking for good harvests. Elders claim that on certain nights when storms crawl over the forest, the air smells of iron and the soil trembles in threes. They whisper that the engineer still listens, measuring the weight of memory. Visitors sometimes feel things they can't explain. A traveler from Germany wrote in his diary, "Inside the tunnel, my flashlight blinked 3 times, paused 3 again. Later I learned the story. I still dream of that heartbeat." Another, a Vietnamese American whose father fought near Tay Ninh, described hearing a whisper in the dark, a single English word drawn out like breath engineer. In 2020, a small earthquake rippled through the Cu Chi region, barely enough to rattle dishes, yet sensors across 3 provinces recorded it. The waveform was peculiar, not random, but structured 3 equal surges, then silence. When researchers compared it with Huy's 1970 recordings, the frequencies matched perfectly. Same rhythm, same pulse, as if time itself had inhaled through the same underground throat 50 years later. At dawn, farmers found one irrigation trench collapsed, not jagged, but in a perfect spiral. The soil glowed faintly for hours, warm to the touch. Beneath it lay a rusted compass, its needle spinning, pointing down. Perhaps coincidence. Perhaps the earth replaying the rhythms of bombs and footsteps. Yet why do the vibrations stop whenever someone listens too closely? Why do all the instruments fail exactly at the 3rd beat? Maybe because something down there does not want to be recorded, only remembered. In that sense, Huy succeeded. He went deeper than any map could measure. He crossed the boundary between structure and story until they became the same thing. He gave the earth a language, and it has spoken ever since. At night, when the museum lights dim and the cicadas drone, the staff sometimes claim to hear a scraping beneath the floors, metal dragging through clay. It's just the tunnels settling, say the curators, but the older guards shake their heads and murmur he's still measuring. If you ever visit Cu Chi, you might feel it too. The air there is thick, heavy with memory. Step off the path, kneel down, press your ear to the ground, listen carefully. At first you'll hear nothing, only your own pulse. But wait. Another rhythm joins it, slower, deeper, older. 3 pulses, a pause. Maybe it's echo. Maybe imagination. Or maybe it's him. The engineer still reporting from beneath the earth. And when you rise, brushing the red dust from your hands, you might feel a faint vibration lingering in your bones, as though the ground has memorized your heartbeat, now added you to its map. Because some tunnels never close, some stories never stop breathing, and some echoes refuse to die. This was the final entry in the file once labeled Case 12B. Its conclusion, written in fading ink, reads only, "Anomalous resonance continuing." You have been listening to the tunnel engineer of Cu Chi, the giant worms beneath the earth. You've heard the evidence, the reports, the myths, the pulse that bridges both. The rest is silence. Or maybe not. Listen again. The hum never really stops. You just have to know where to stand. You've just heard another record from Echoes of the Unknown. If you want to hear more, subscribe and keep listening to the voices the earth still remembers.